Go ahead and start recording for posterity. Um, so today we are going to continue talking about Russia. I don't have, to be honest, I don't have as much planned for today. It's kind of nice as we, hit the midpoint in the semester in a class where I don't do midterms anymore, to take a little bit of a breather day, not a full break day, but something where we can catch up, make sure that we're all feeling pretty comfortable with the material so far, talk about a little bit of Russia, a little bit of post-communism, but just make sure that we're at a good place for the semester, to be able to move forward. So we talked about on Monday, the governmental structure of Russia, and Russia still is stuck in your book in this section under communism and post-communism. But I do want to pose the question to you today: is that really where Russia belongs now? I kind of skirted on Monday around the question, nobody asked it outright, but around that question of how communistic is Russia still to this day. This kind of general post-communism idea that doesn't really mean anything, right? It's sorry, that's the peek behind the curtain of political science. Like, it has meaning, but like, does it actually mean anything to us for our state? It means that at some point Russia was communist, right? And yes, a significant portion of Russian history, especially recent Russian history, has been defined by communism. Russia is still strongly associated with communism in our minds, and the ways that we interpret communism as it is implemented in the world. That is all a fairly Western ideological belief, right? Because we're still, we live in the United States, most of us. In the United States, we still see Russia as the other side of the Cold War, even though we know it ended long before most of you were alive, as we've established. Even more so, the further along we get, the further we get from 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the USSR, this major shift in global socio-political cultures. The further we get from that, the stranger it is that we kind of maintain this idea of Russia as the preeminent communistic representation in the world. That isn't to say that there aren't good reasons for that. We don't really have much to directly compare it to. We have, countries that are still communist. Most of them, even the ones where communist parties still are in control, like China, which we will discuss next week. Most of them have implemented aspects of capitalism into the structure. They're not by any means what I think Marx would have envisioned a capitalist, or a communist utopia to look like. But we're still dealing with this sort of global emotion, I think, of the Cold War. And we still are stuck in some of these Cold War mentalities when it comes to viewing other countries. And so that jades our view of Russia. The question that I asked, and then I just started talking, let me ask it again. How communist is Russia today? Off of your readings, off of our discussion, what's your viewpoint on this?
I would argue Russia is quite communist because, like, Gazprom and the major companies that drive the economy in Russia are still state-owned, or if they're not state-owned, they're controlled by some oligarch who is not the state, but is very connected to the state.
Okay, so economically, as Reese points out, there's still this echo of communism, and I don't mean that to diminish what Reese said. Like, there are still aspects of these extensive ties between the government and control of business, control of the means of production, right? In Marx's terms, there are specific areas where that is strongest, things like oil and gas. That is something, just as a facet of the modern world, that we see in countries that are less democratic. That's one of the easiest ways for a government to exert control over the economy of its own country. So this is not something unique to Russia either. This is also very much so the case in Brazil. We see that the government has extensive control over oil and gas. And by an extension of that, anything that's privately owned is still owned by somebody who has clear, extensive ties to the government. So the government, as it exists in Russia today, is very much so Vladimir Putin's government, right? And so to look at these facets that Reese brings up, we have to keep that in mind. There are other people in government in Russia that do have degrees of power. It's power that is given to them, is granted to them by Vladimir Putin. From a purely governmental perspective, Russia is all but a dictatorship in all but name at this point. That doesn't mean that there aren't still strong aspects, especially economically, of communism in the country. They tried to move away from that. In the early 1990s, it was Boris Yeltsin, right? Banned communist parties in Russia because the Soviet Union had collapsed, and it had collapsed in large part due to the economic instability of communist Russia. So political parties were banned outright. They came back because there's still a lot of people, even in Russia today, who believe that communism is the best approach for Russia, for the people of Russia. In fact, the second largest political party in Russia now is the Communist Party. So there are still very strong expressions of communism. But how do we balance that? How do we look at a country like Russia that seems to have these conflicting ideologies, that it has such a strong tie, a strong history of communism, and yet the governmental structure now has become so far removed from that ideology? It's still expressed by political parties who have less and less power the more power that is concentrated under Vladimir Putin. So, a government that is intentionally moving away from this communist ideology, and yet it is still present and still has strong aspects that influence the country. How does it work for the normal person in Russia? What does that look like?
On the face of the original question, I would, and this will lead into me going into the second question as well, but I would argue that Russia itself is not communist. It is a oligarchical dictatorship using the populist guise of things such as communism and democracy as tools to try and build a facade of support in order to make it seem like, at least on the global theater, that the people are supporting what the overall heads of government are doing. I wouldn't say that most of the practices fall in line with either democracy or communism specifically, as much as there's shades and semblances of both of them. They do hold an election. Whether or not that's an actual election is, up for debate very easily. But the reality is, and I think, oh gosh, Alexei
Navalny.
Navalny, thank you.
Alexei Navalny.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much went through to prove that a couple years back, and just trying to get any candidate to be on the same level of perceived approval of what Putin is, even while polls would put Putin at a much, much lower percentage in all reality.
I just
Absolutely.
want to jump in here and say communism and a dictatorship are not mutually exclusive things. A dictatorship is a governmental structure, and communism is an economic structure. So while I'd agree that Russia is not fully communist anymore, justifying that by using the oligarchical dictatorship as an example doesn't really substantiate, because that's a governmental system versus an economic one. That's two different things.
And those aren't the only two things either, right? We have, and this does harken back to where we started some of our examination in this class. We have this ongoing difficulty of when we create categories and then try to sort countries into them, this is what we will run into. Because we can say that, from a developmental perspective, communism should be everything, right? In a way that democracy never was. Democracy never claimed to be the basis of an economic system as well, right? It was a form of government. That's why we have it in the ocracy category, not in the ideology category. It is a liberal form of government when we look at ideologies, but liberalism, with big L liberalism, doesn't have that same tie to specific forms of economic expression. Communism does, or at least wants to. Let me check in real quick with Ray Lynn. I saw you mention that you're getting glitchy. Is that coming through?
It's a lot better now. I just changed my Wi-Fi.
Okay, sweet. I just want to make sure that you weren't sitting there not being able to hear anything. I've done that. One of my professors, because I think I mentioned that I am doing a PhD as well. One of my professors started class on Zoom and then muted himself to screen share, and then for the next 3 hours didn't notice that he was still muted. So that was a very long, exciting class of not being able to hear anything my professor said. Yeah, so I try not to do that. So we have these, sort of seemingly conflicting definitions where communism should be all encapsulating. And yet the way that we see it in practice, the way that we see it in Russia, is a partial post-communistic state. Their economy isn't entirely communistic either, not in the way that it's envisioned, not in the way that Lenin envisioned, or Marx envisioned, or obviously Mao envisioned. Like, that's not the economy that Russia has today. There's not, equal pay across the board for, equal work. It's not the principles on which communism was built. But this almost new form of communism, this deep embedding of business interests with the government. And we'll see this in a few other countries that we're going to look at as well. It doesn't always look the way that it does in Russia. In Russia, it is very much so about control. The government Putin as practically synonyms now. The government wants to control the business aspects of Russia. That's not necessarily the case in China. In China, it's a coordination of bureaucracy. It's not the case in Japan, where it's an interaction between government officials and business interests. There are different ways of expressing this, but it's important to remember that in Russia, what we see is this aspect of domination and control. That extends to a lot of different aspects of Russian life. So I asked the question, briefly as an extension of, how does this look for the people of Russia? How does this play out? Thinking in those terms, what do you think political identity looks like in Russia? Even compare it to the United States. In the United States, we have two major political parties. We have a lot of literature out there talking about that political identity, right? Party identification. You may or may not, but you may have a political party alignment that is very deeply embedded in who you consider yourself to be as a person, right? And that is something that we see for most people in the United States. They will deeply identify as either a Democrat or a Republican. We see voting trends that come off of that. We see that expressed in the way that our politics is run, because you can run a campaign based on those two words instead of actual policy. So how does that differ in Russia? What would you think? It doesn't have to be right. You can be right, but what would you think that might look like in a country where we see this conflicting economic system and we see very strong personal government that's centered around a person?
I would imagine that a lot of it is more closeted in regards to political opinion, because potentially speaking out against any dictatorial power while you're living within that regime would pose potential social risks and potentially personal safety risks on top of that. So I would imagine that if a lot of, most people that individually would disagree with the government, even if it is a majority of the country, would disagree in private as opposed to public.
Okay, so one option is that it might silence or oppress voices of dissent. The stronger that a government becomes, the stronger a state becomes in that control, the less likely you might want to risk speaking out. That is absolutely something that we see in Russia. We see that there is a reluctance, and it's not quite what it was with it's not quite what it was in the 70s or the 80s, where if you spoke out against the USSR, you got disappeared. It's not that universal anymore, but that fear, I think, is still there. You see, I don't even know how to phrase it without it sounding like I'm making light of it, but you see the periodic poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the major voice that speaks out against Putin's regime and Putin's political party. If you're, searching for the words here, United Russia has been the prominent political party since 1999. That is Putin's party. It was created to help Vladimir Putin's run for office in 1999 when he initially ran for president. Then he took a brief stint as prime minister and then came back as president, while the president was someone that he personally appointed. It's timelines get fun, but United Russia is the main political party. There are opposition parties, but when you become a loud voice in those opposition parties, weirdly bad things tend to happen to you. Okay, we're living in an era of globalization, so it's not like Vladimir Putin can just execute political opposition. That's not the way of the world anymore. That would almost instantly start a war. But that's not the only option. He has been very successful in the past 4 elections now at preventing Alexei Navalny from running. And that's very significant, because the last time that there was a more free and open election in Russia was in 2011. And in 2011, not at the presidential level, Vladimir Putin was still extremely popular at the presidential level and had a landslide victory. Yes, there's probably corruption in those numbers. Yes, that it may not be an accurate representation of the true feeling of the Russian people on Vladimir Putin. But the truth is, he's extraordinarily popular in Russia. He has done a significant amount of work in the views of the Russian people, and especially in the views of the Russian media, which he controls. He has done a significant amount of work to reestablish Russia as a prominent force on the global stage. He is almost single-handedly, while being in control of the government, he has almost single-handedly reconstituted the strength of the Russian people that he envisioned. He's been extraordinarily successful up until the invasion of Ukraine. But in all other things, he has been extraordinarily successful in achieving those political goals that he ran on. So there is power there. There is, a populist movement, but a populist movement that follows through on its promises, which is a rare populist movement in the world. So yes, extraordinarily popular, has won, even in some of the fairer elections since he was initially elected, has won significant portions of the vote. But in 2011, the State Duma didn't see as much of a landslide as it expected. United Russia still won a majority of the votes in the 2011 State Duma election, but it was a much closer margin than Putin and United Russia as a party expected. The opposition parties came too close to 50% of the vote all told. I think it was somewhere in the range of 47% of the vote went to opposition parties. So that spooked United Russia. That allowed for a change in policy and a change in the approach to elections to move away from having those open and fair elections that you might see in a truly democratic system. And the Constitution that was written in 1991 established a democratic republic, but one with weaker safeguards, like I mentioned last class, weaker safeguards to maintaining how democratic that truly was. So it allowed for this domino effect to start, where the weakening of those elections, the weakening of the legitimacy of the elections, the questioning of whether elections had been legitimately carried out, whether the representation was truly of the Russian people or not, had this domino effect that just allowed Putin to accrue power until we get to the major upset in 2020, where Vladimir Putin has his prime minister and all of the members of the cabinet resign simultaneously so that he can approve changes to the constitution itself directly. I think all of this is important to track and to understand and to look at, because when we talk about post-communism, we can, again, draw a line to a very specific point. We can say, yeah, Russia, the USSR was communist. After the fall of the USSR, they became not communist, or, the communism became a minority representation in the country. It continued in some smaller parties, but it has not come back to political prominence since then. We can draw those lines, but they're the fuzziest of lines that exist, because we're not talking about direct and separated definitions. We're talking about things that exist along a spectrum. So the slow move over a period of, how long ago was 1991? 30 years, old. 31 years ago. Gosh darn it. Please tell me I'm not the only one sitting in this room who was alive when the USSR was still around. Anyone gonna save me on that?
I was born in 89.
And Logan, I'll take it. Fantastic. Probably before November.
Yeah, March of 89.
Awesome. All right, there's two of us. Yep, our fond memories of living in a world with the USSR, as very young children, but still, it's in that 31-year time frame, we've seen all of these shifts in a time where really it should be stable, right? They have a constitution, it establishes a democratic republic. That's the ideal. The international relations assumption, and this is not me bashing on international relations, don't go tell Nevin Aiken that I said anything negative about international relations. The international relations assumption is that stability from a constitutional democratic republic should ensure little change in the structure of the Russian Federation until such a time as it is either overthrown or undermined in legitimacy in some way. I don't think that's the case. I think that it is very fair to say that economically there are still representations of new communism in Russia, while the Russian government, under the guidance of Vladimir Putin and his United Russia Party, have moved the government more towards a dictatorship. Those are fair statements. We see this not only in Russia, but in a lot of countries where we have strong representation from one end of the political spectrum, be that a liberal, a little L liberal communistic movement, be that a right-wing movement like United Russia is a very right-wing party. We see that in Greece as well. We see these, President Erdogan in Turkey is very right-wing, almost has modeled his political career off of Putin, but would never say that out loud because that's not giving himself enough credit. That movement, echoes what we see in Russia. And so we see these shifts within this overarching idea of democracy. And yet we still look back at history and we still say, oh, I wonder, we kind of wax nostalgic on, oh, I don't know how the Nazis could have come to power in Germany. How within a democratic system, a dictatorship may arise. We've watched it happen. Logan and I during our lifetimes. No, during your lifetimes, it has happened in one of the largest, most economically powerful countries in the world. So it isn't fair to call Russia communist anymore. It's not really fair to call them post-communist, because other than the fact that once they were very communist, now they're something else. But we don't have a lot of terminology to really discuss beyond that in terms of ideology. Because at the moment, Russia's really the one that we've seen go through this kind of shift. When we talk about China next week, we don't see that same cult of personality arise around singular figures. And it isn't just Vladimir Putin either. Boris Yeltsin did the exact same thing. I mentioned political ideologies earlier in this class because though they are very strong in the United States, they are very weak in Russia. And other than United Russia, which has stuck around for a couple of decades now, 20 some years, 23 years. Other than United Russia, the political parties change their name on a monthly basis, especially in the 90s. You would see political parties arise around individual politicians running for state Dumas. And that wasn't uncommon. That was, a facet of the federation, because you could have single state political parties that had representation in the federal government, in the state Duma. So you saw a different way of conceptualizing political parties, a way that for the Russian people meant that there's not a lot of reason to get personally attached to a political party, right? If political parties changed with the politicians and we had state level political parties that got representation in Congress, the strength of the Democratic and Republican parties would be significantly less. There wouldn't be reason to identify as one or the other if there's a risk, if there's a good likelihood that the Democratic Party is going to, disappear next year, and we'll see the rise of, the Progressive Party in the United States. And then, once Bernie Sanders is voted out of office, then the Progressive Party goes away, and whoever the next politician is gets to name their own party. And that party is the new Democratic Party, right? If it changed that frequently, there wouldn't be that association. And that's what we see in Russia. So for individual people, for the common person living in Russia, there's no reason to and no need to identify with a political party. But we still clamber towards some kind of political identity. And so unfortunately, what has filled that gap is the reliance on a very nationalistic adherence to individual politicians. So in the absence of political party structure, we see a rise in candidate-centric elections, where United Russia, it might have a platform. Platforms are also kind of a new idea for political parties in the world. It might have a political platform. I honestly don't know. I could have looked it up. I honestly don't know if they have a platform or not. If they do, it doesn't matter what that platform is, because you don't need a platform when all you have to worry about is adherence to one individual. And I think that the action we've seen in the Ukraine is a very clear expression of that. Because the way that the war in Ukraine went down was Russia, Vladimir Putin said we're invading the Ukraine, and the Russian government followed suit because Vladimir Putin is the Russian government. Now, that opens up questions. Maybe questions that you can discuss as I glance at Will. Maybe questions you can discuss in discussion this week. That opens up questions of what happens in a semi-dictatorship when the dictator is no longer in power. 5 years ago, we all knew that Vladimir Putin was going to do something to stay in power. That was no question. I remember having conversations with a friend of mine who is Russian and does a lot of Russian political studies. I remember having a chat with her about this, about Vladimir Putin's election is coming up. How likely is it we'll actually see change? And she was just like, none. not whatsoever. We've known for years that this was going to happen. But he is still human. As far as we know, he hasn't discovered immortality yet. So at some point, Vladimir Putin's going to die. And unlike the UK, as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, there is not a strong plan for continuity. Because plans for continuity rely on the stability of political party systems. In a country without those strong political party systems, what happens after the center of the political party goes away? It's a difficult line of thinking. It's something, like I said, maybe you can continue this if you are interested in this as one of your questions for discussion. These are all things we can discuss around Russia as a central point of examination. So you may have noticed in our country examination so far, the reason that I set everything up the way that I did with our examination of ideologies, our examination of governmental systems, our examination of economic systems, all of these are just ways of talking about countries and of ways of holding them up against one another to examine certain facets of the way the country runs. It also means that we can start to centralize our understanding of these different countries in terms of what power is held and who holds it. So in the United States, power is concentrated in Congress. Even if it feels like the president is getting more and more powerful, which they are, even if that is the case, Congress is still, by and large, the most powerful branch of government in the United States. So that is the central focus of power in the American system. The central focus of power in the UK system is the monarch. Now, King Charles III. In Queen Elizabeth, it may not have always looked that way. And, I know we talked about this a lot during class, but it was Queen Elizabeth's ability to not wield that power that was the core of the continuity of the monarchy. So the power was still concentrated in Queen Elizabeth, but her choice to only use it when necessary helped maintain the monarchy for decades. So the power is concentrated in that monarchy. In Russia, the power is concentrated in Vladimir Putin. You could say in the president, but really, that's not accurate. When he stepped down and Medvedev was president, Medvedev did not wield the power of the presidency. That power moved with Vladimir Putin to the prime minister position and then moved back when he was reelected. So now in Russia, the power lies with Vladimir Putin. And I'll give you that structure as a way of considering the rest of the countries that we have in class. We will continue to talk. I'll continue to come back to this, visiting this, central summary from a comparative perspective that just gives you that core idea of why these countries can have similar looking systems, but such radically different outcomes and such radically different governmental setups. Because, like we said, Russia still has the 3 branches of government, but they're very different than the US and the UK that we examined a week ago. Any thoughts? Things that have popped up in your mind as we've been looking at Russia this week? Am I completely wrong on anything? I mean, you're welcome to say like, nah, you're full of it. This is, I don't know. Vladimir Putin isn't in power.
I mean, with the conflict in Ukraine, an addition on it is arguably it's a vehicle for him to get rid of political dissonance within Russia due to the way the Russian military works on a compulsory basis. He just drafts anyone that disagrees with him and sends them to war in order to die. So, I mean, a way to ensure political stability for him.
I mean, sort of, yes. I think the view of the draft as trying to get your own people killed is a very negative one. I didn't say inaccurate. I said negative. It's very pessimistic. But I think there is a philosophical basis as well as a practical basis to what you're saying. The idea is if you experience dissonance, if you have dissidents, not dissonance, I mean, both work, but dissidents within your country, there is nothing more powerful than uniting against a common enemy. That is the theory that Michael Crichton got like obsessed with towards the end of his writing career. If you go read Michael Crichton's novels, the author of Jurassic Park, he continued and has several fantastic books, but he ends up, one of the last books he wrote was State of Fear. And it basically postulates this idea that we always have to be collectively afraid of something. And so he uses, I don't think it's the strongest example, but he uses, once we terrorism in the early 2000s was something that was a very uniting force for the United States. That was what people were afraid of. As that started to drop off, he says that the fear of killer African bees was floated. If you remember when, like, for 2 weeks at the beginning of a summer, all of the news stories were about killer African bees. He says that was a completely made up and falsified story, but that it was used to test the idea that we needed something to be collectively afraid of. And it was just an unsuccessful example of that. I don't know. I'm putting that out there as like, it's an interesting idea. I'm not saying that Michael Crichton was right in that, but there is a core, there is a core value there that we do see, which is that if you can unite people against a common enemy, or if you can instill in people a common fear, which is what we saw before the invasion of Ukraine. Russian media attempted to unite people in fear of what they were calling an autocratic, dictatorial, crazy communist, like every word you can imagine was thrown at the Ukraine as, this is what the Ukraine is. We have to save it from itself. You instill that common fear, you create that common enemy, and then it's supposed to justify the actions that you then take. And I don't think you're wrong in pointing that out. And from a political perspective, I'm sure there was somebody who told Putin that that could be a win-win, because either you very decisively, effectively win the war, you invade the Ukraine successfully, or if you are unable to win the war quickly, you're able to institute a draft, which means you call into service of the state the majority population of young, impressionable potential dissidents, and you unify them under one banner. That's a very old way of thinking. That's a very like pre-1950s way of thinking, because it doesn't take into account the technological changes that we've seen that have allowed individual people access to more information. And I'm just talking about, we haven't seen, thinking in that way does not acknowledge the mass protests against the war in Ukraine from the people of Russia, because they have access to information outside of Russia. I mean, as much as Russia can try to shut down Facebook and WhatsApp and any social media platform, messages still get in and out because we're in a technological age where that is impossible to control. So at least there's that little bit of hope that the dictators of the world and the potential dictators of the world are slowly losing the ability to have that complete grasp on information flow, which is one of the central tenets of authoritarianism, is that you have to have control of information. So, Vladimir Putin probably should have taken that into account. I think it is a large part, at least, of why we're not seeing this as successful in either of those ways. We see enough dissent in the country of Russia that, it's not going along with this grand plan that Vladimir Putin seems to have. So yes, I think that the summary of that, the invasion of Ukraine makes sense when you understand the history and current political climate of Russia. It's not good, but good and bad are moralistic terms. We're talking about, it makes sense for Vladimir Putin to have done this when he did, when you get all of these pieces in place and understand these contexts. Okay. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Like I said, there's still a lot that we can discuss in this. So I think we'll have a great discussion on Friday with Will. And I will see you next week for jumping into China and talking about all of these terms and what communism means in China and, oh gosh, the control of bureaucracy. Yeah, sorry, spoilers, there you go. The power in China is concentrated in bureaucracy. Sweet. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let me, I forget where okay, maybe it's me. The button keeps moving for where stop recording is.